When incarnation ceases to become automatic, I'm assuming that the entity can decide when he needs to reincarnate for the benefit of his own learning. Does he also select his parents?
The physical universe as idea construction.
I got inside cautiously and locked the door behind me once I heard no one was inside, still approaching cautiously. I walked into my room and saw his shoes first, and then I saw his body lying still. He was dressed like he was going out, or had already been out. In disbelief of what I was seeing, I looked into his face, and there was no life left in his open eyes. Through tears that began falling, I could see his face had already turned a pale blue, his arms an odd, lifeless color of pale purple and blue. I still hadn't made plans to go back home after learning that my grandfather passed. A bit of shock set in, I guess, though. The date for the funeral approached fast, and it kind of didn't sink in with me at first. I was consumed with a job I wasn't happy at, working as a young assistant manager of a restaurant. I'd never lost anyone very close to me in my life before this, and as the date for the funeral approached, a sadness fell on me. I suddenly realized that this job I worked so hard to get promoted at couldn't stop me. I couldn't miss his funeral and feel okay about it. I quit my job with no notice and packed my things to move back to Maryland just as suddenly. I packed my car up with what little I owned and made the 48-hour drive alone again. This time no Texas and no blizzards. Just the 3 or so days of driving the more central route of the surprisingly empty country. I arrived to meet with family at my Uncle Bobby's Potomac, Maryland home to mourn the loss of a great man. Sadly, I missed the funeral and could only make it to the gathering after. The guilt of missing it, coupled with the fact that I hadn't even originally planned to go to his funeral, had tears flowing from my eyes uncontrollably that day. I'd known he'd lived a good long life, and that if there was a heaven, he'd be in it. It didn't ease the sadness or my guilt, though. That same week that I'd arrived home, after having been gone for a year or so, I'd gone to the Francis Scott Key Mall in my hometown for whatever reason that I can't remember. To my surprise, I see walking towards me George and Mike. I hadn't been in touch with Mike for at least over 2 years, but when it came to our friendship, it was as if a day had never passed. As we got to talking and catching up, I quickly found out that Mike and George had a nice 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment together in a really nice neighborhood close by, on the outskirts of the city. It was in Kingsborough, one of the nice, newer developed areas near the FSK Mall that I ran into them at. I can't remember exactly what we'd done that day, as the 3 of us left the mall, but we went to their apartment soon after. I'm pretty sure we went, had a smoke, a drink, and chilled with some mutual friends. I quickly found out that George was in the process of moving out. He had only a few things left there remaining. It turns out that he was moving back into his pop's place because his girlfriend, who was living with them, had recently left him. He said he didn't want to stay because the place reminded him of her, that he didn't like the vibe of being left there to that room alone. I didn't know George all that well, but he was only 18 or so, and kind of seemed like an emotional guy, and that was seeming to work in my favor. I just inherited his spot. Like clockwork, when I arrived, unexpectedly, with basically no money and no job, it didn't matter. The room in this really nice apartment was now mine. It didn't take long for Mike to be back to his old ways of selling coke and weed, after having been back fresh off of a 1.5-year prison sentence. Along with that was his habit of using that soon came back. His girlfriend Heather and I had been doing a good job of keeping him off coke for the first couple months of moving in with him, but slowly he'd fold to the temptation. I tried to just keep him smoking herb and drinking the Coronas he liked, which felt completely harmless in comparison. Heather tried to keep him limited to doing pills of ecstasy with her, so that was even helpful in comparison to him snorting coke. Ecstasy and pills was her thing, smoking was mine back then. I'd roll 2 or 3 blunts a day, since we basically had a limitless stream of weed coming from his main connection in DC. I'd gone with him one time to meet up with G in Northwest DC. I was a little surprised that he drove a modest Dodge Ram pickup truck. An obviously smart man to not be driving in a flashy ride to do his business, I thought. Mike was losing interest in smoking herb these days. He said he didn't like how it drained his energy level. He preferred uppers. But besides drinking Coronas, he wasn't doing drugs when we'd chill, living together those days. He'd only take pills with Heather. But then, they began to fight sometimes. She was a feisty Colombian girl with a lot of attitude. To this day, I can't really figure out what they'd come up with to fight about so much. Their fights would last for days without them talking though, and that's when Mike really started using hard again. I didn't like it when Mike was using coke for many reasons, but one was because he'd get real quiet. He wouldn't even really respond when you try to ask him something. I knew better than to try having a conversation with him when he'd be coked up, but in our younger years, he didn't used to be like that on it. He loved the way it made him feel though, so there was really no stopping him. Every morning, around 8 or 9 a.m., he'd come kicking at my mattress that laid low, near the ground, on a pull-out couch's conversion bed cushion. He was obviously more of a morning person than I was, even though I never did wake up grumpy. I just obviously liked to sleep in more than he did those days. He'd come wake me up, either wanting to go driving the country roads, or to the mall just to meet girls or whatever. Mostly for me though, because he had Heather, who he was crazy about. I returned home to Maryland with a nice newer car on 17-inch rims. Super clean looking, dark green, sporty car. Mike was a little envious of how I surprisingly came back in style like I did, as he stated once, in a funny way. Growing up, with food stamps, on welfare, in the projects, through middle school, after my parents split up, I never imagined how I'd be able to get a car, much less a nice looking car, like I'd gotten through a loan. Still, he was the one with all the right connections, and all the money that he wanted basically. He told me that he saw that he needed to step up his game from the old white Chrysler New Yorker he was in. So, what he did was contact a bunch of people who usually needed weed from him, and made an effort to get what they needed to them. In 3 weeks, he had made $10,000 in cash. He put it in clear plastic baggies, and we went together to a private car dealership outside DC and purchased a forest green Jeep Grand Cherokee with leather and all the upgrades. Not brand new, but still in great condition, and a really good looking ride to park next to mine outside. To say Mike was a little competitive would be an understatement. The guy wanted to have the best and to be the best at everything he did. I remember going with him to see his mom one day for whatever reason. We went to have lunch with her at the little airport diner in our city that day. Somehow we got to talking about Mike's dad and his younger years, how he was shot, hit multiple times and almost killed during a drug deal in California, a long way from where he and Mike's mother were from, in New York City. Mike had also told me that his pops had done some years in prison for moving hundreds of pounds of weed across the country, but was betrayed by some of his business partners somehow. Regardless of the case exactly, this life was just in his blood, and it was clear that this was all Mike wanted to do. He was content, and with the money he made, and with his setup, I couldn't really blame him. Though paranoid and worried at times, he lived set with money, and never really worked a full day in his life, I think. One night, Mike and I had gone off to a house party, and while we'd usually always go places together in one vehicle, this night was different. I had a girl I was going to see there at the party. It was her place, and I thought maybe I'd stay later. So we decided that maybe we should drive separately this time. He drove his Jeep Grand Cherokee, and I drove my little dark, forest green Honda out to her house. We were supposed to chill over there with a handful of friends for some drinks and smokes. That'd get messed up by some drama by another friend though. Chad, I think. He'd gotten drunk and upset about some money or drugs he was owed, but wasn't getting paid, I guess. A window was broken and threats were made, before the police were called and the party was officially called off. It was already pretty late by the time that we decided to cruise out there, so when we got there and heard what happened, we just decided to go get some food. Knowing how Mike drove, I told him I'd follow him as long as he drove the speed limit and didn't get crazy. I know I needed to tell him that for some reason, and he drove just fine. That is, until when we were just about to pull into the food spot, he suddenly peeled out, mashing the gas pedal around a turn at an intersection. At that point, I'm trailing behind a little bit and see the red and blue lights light up behind him. I knew this night wasn't ending well for him. Having already been on parole and less than a year out after serving a year and a half in the penitentiary outside DC, this was the last thing he needed. He'd told me that he wasn't going back to jail, but I knew that wasn't all that believable. He told me once, when I was trying to get him off coke and to get more disciplined, that it was too late for him. He'd say that I had time to change and to be something else, but for him, it was too late. I couldn't really understand why and tried to talk some sense into him, being that he was only 20 years old. He felt old and set in his ways, really. He had the most stubborn personality, perhaps, and had really decided that this life was how he was going to live it out. After the lights lit him up, and I saw the police cruiser pull him over in the parking lot, I drove out of there and went home. I knew he was riding around with everything on him, like he almost always did. He had 6 pounds of weed and $4,500 in cash on him in the truck this time. Obviously, it was all confiscated, and he had the Cherokee impounded. Facing 10 years in prison this time around on these new charges, he took the only other way out at the time. He'd basically become an informant, setting up 2 of his connections and giving them up to police. They wanted the bigger fish to fry, and Mike was about to serve them up. He was starting from scratch again, no money, no ride, and facing 10 years in prison if he didn't give the police what they wanted. He quickly put another plan together though, and had this all figured out in his mind. Rarely did he not know exactly what to do or say, and this time he put a plan into action without delay. We met with George and came up with the exact plan. He was starting from scratch again. No money, no ride, and facing 10 years in prison if he didn't give the police what they wanted. Mike had some guys from out of town that previously came to him for weight, and they were looking to re-up at just the right time, or rather, the wrong time, depending on which side of this you were on. Mike asked me if I'd help for a cut of what we were going to get. I always had Mike's back, basically no matter what, so I was in. The plan was fairly simple, that George and I would drive down to DC and pick Mike up, driving him back to our hometown, 45 minutes away, with $10,000 in cash. You see, after Mike had met up with the guy from out of town, they drove down to DC to meet Mike's connection. Because of the scale of the amount of weed they needed, Mike said that he didn't have this much, and that they needed to go get it directly from his connect. Once in DC, Mike got the cash and went into the familiar apartment building, and instead of coming back with 15 pounds of weed, he went out the back door of the building and to the car that George and I were waiting in. Once back home, Mike made the arrangement and met with his real connection. This time he got everything he needed to set up shop again. Not only that, he'd found another almost identical forest green Jeep Grand Cherokee and paid for it in $6,000 cash. He was suddenly right back where he was, not even 2 weeks earlier, as if he'd never even been busted and stripped of everything he had. After meeting with police and lawyers to work out the details of his upcoming case, he'd learned that his lawyer could have gotten him out of all the charges for everything they'd found, due to the reason to search that the officer wrote in the report. Apparently everything could have been thrown out. According to Mike's lawyer, it was an illegal search conducted that night. This police officer wrote that he'd searched the Jeep because Mike looked nervous and suspicious, not a legal reason for police to search someone's vehicle in the state of Maryland. A technicality that would have been enough to drop all charges, according to what Mike's lawyer had told him. It was too late for that though. The police released Mike under that one condition, and they'd already gotten the guys he'd promised them for his freedom. Making the call to one of his connections from Baltimore for 20 pounds of weed, his connect drove it down the highway to our city, and Mike made the next call. He told the police where they could find him waiting with 20 pounds. Next, a DC connection Mike had, and the same thing went down, this time for 15 pounds, and Mike was looking like his 10-year sentence was being taken care of. The third connection was someone Mike never gave up to police, his oldest connect, G from DC, who he'd been working with for over 5 years, ever since he began. He went to G for whatever he needed, and G had all the coke and weed Mike would ever need. It was all too easy, but we still had our reasons to be looking over our shoulders. Even though the connections Mike had set up didn't know where we lived, I'd only learned, after Mike robbed the guy in DC for the $10,000 in cash, that him and some of his boys had actually been to Mike and George's apartment before, the one Mike and I'd currently lived in. They lived far away in another state, and our apartment in Kingsbrook was a bit of a maze to get into if you didn't know the area. Still, it wasn't exactly a comfortable living situation. The days were getting a little darker, and I obviously had some bad feelings about how things were going, especially when Mike and Heather began fighting again, and Mike called my phone one day. He was apparently coked out of his mind on one of his multiple day binges, paranoid and pacing our apartment, checking windows for anyone trying to run up on him in there. Strangely, he called me that particular day, asking to talk to Heather. He said, "Let me talk to Heather, I know you're with her. I know she's been cheating on me with you." I was with a friend of mine shooting basketball at the park on a nice day and told him, "Mike, I'd never do that to you, first of all. Second, Heather doesn't like me, and you know that. She'd always acted like she didn't like me, and for no real obvious reason, ever since I moved in. Jealous of the times Mike and I chilled together without involving her, and keeping him distracted from her when they'd fight was my only guess. Anyway, I handed my phone to my friend, and told him to tell Mike that we weren't even with any girls, especially not Heather, and that we were shooting the ball in the park. He gave the phone back and Mike asked me, "You aren't with her?" I laughed to ease the uncomfortable tension and told him, "Bro, no, of course I'm not with Heather." I told him I'd meet up with him later, again assuring him that I'd never do that to him, and hung up. It was a scary moment actually, because he'd never accused me of something like this, and who really knew what he might do if he was coked up enough and really thought I was stealing Heather from him. I wasn't actually scared of him, and he absolutely never gave me a reason to be. I was really concerned about him at that point though. I just decided to stay with other friends of mine the next few nights to let things blow over and to let him sober up. I was staying in other places more and more these days because of the unsettling feeling that the place could be run up on by guys with guns looking for their $10,000 at any moment. One of those nights, I remember staying at my good friend Tyler's place with a few childhood friends, and a couple of us had decided to eat some mushrooms. Before long I was really tripping hard and having some strange thoughts. I needed to get some fresh air outside, so Tyler came with me to have a smoke and to keep an eye on me. We always knew that it was best to have a sober friend or two around when tripping on anything like mushrooms or acid. Out on his huge front grass lawn, it started to rain, And being midsummer, to me it felt great. I kind of just stood watching the sky a little and commanded out loud for the sky to show me lightning. Yes, a really strange thing to do, and a type of thing I never did before or after this time. But as soon as I said it, the first lightning of the night, that we'd seen anyway, flashed and lit up the sky. I asked Tyler if he saw it, and confirmed that he'd seen it too. I didn't have any psychic or special abilities that I knew of, but I was really feeling kind of spiritually tuned in some kind of way, especially because of what happened next, and would happen in coming days. The mushrooms, of course. Tyler was a teenage actor, and once had a role in a murder mystery type of show in the 90s. He played a bad teenager, smoking a cigarette and talking with a police investigator in the episode he was in. It was an old TV show called The Commish, if I'm not mistaken. He lived that bad boy persona in real life too, only from a big 7-bedroom home in a really nice neighborhood. Smoking cigarettes, experimenting with drugs, and always trying to find something to get into. That was us. But we did everything in a smart and reasonably responsible way. Tyler would say that he felt sometimes as if our lives were like we were in a movie. I knew what he meant. We really could have been a movie cast, all living through really interesting times when we all got together. We'd gone back inside to my other friends who had been waiting there, and we all sat, resting in the huge, beautifully finished basement, where Tyler's room was. Sitting on the couch, I began thinking for some reason that Tyler and my good friend Tim were plotting to tackle me and restrain me for some reason. I could see them talking while they sat together on the couch, but couldn't really hear them. Before they could get to me, I thought, I suddenly jumped up from the couch across the room and bolted up the stairs to the kitchen and picked up the phone and quickly dialed 911. Tyler immediately gave chase to see what I was up to, of course, and when he'd gotten upstairs, he stood watching me on his home phone. The emergency operator already answered, "Emergency 911. I suddenly improvised and somehow sobered up in this moment. I said, "Yes, hi. I need someone to go check my roommate and friend at our apartment. He's been snorting coke for some days and I'm worried that he might hurt himself or someone else." "Okay, what's the address of your apartment?" she responded. "It's in King's Crest Apartments in Kingsbrook. I don't know the exact address since I'd recently moved in," I said. "I can explain where it is and how to get there." "I'm sorry, we need an exact address, or won't be able to send anyone," she said. I sort of quietly sighed in relief. "Okay, thank you. I'll try to find the address and get back to you." As concerned as I was, and meant what I said, I didn't want the police to go to our apartment. I just didn't know what else to say, and that's just what came naturally when I'd snapped out of the bizarre thoughts I was having about my friends there. I hung up the phone feeling almost completely sobered up after this bizarre experience. Tyler, standing there next to me in his dimly lit kitchen, said, "Damn, good save." Those weeks, after we'd robbed the guys from out of town, I stayed at friends' places as much as possible for multiple reasons. I decided one day after staying at my good friend Jamie's parents' place that I'd go back to the apartment to get a fresh change of clothes and to get a long shower. When I got home, I noticed the door wasn't locked when I turned the key. I could feel it unlock every time I turned the key, but something felt different that time. The door was never unlocked. I got inside cautiously and locked the door behind me once I heard no one was inside. Still approaching cautiously, I walked into my room and saw his shoes first, and then I saw his body lying still. He was dressed like he was going out, or had already been out. In disbelief of what I was seeing, I looked into his face, and there was no life left in his open eyes. Through tears that began falling, I could see his face had already turned a pale blue. I touched his shoulder, and he was already getting cold, but I still couldn't really accept that he was dead. It just didn't make sense to me how he could just suddenly be gone. That my best friend, who woke me up almost every day those past 6 months to have a smoke and a drink, laughed and joked with almost every day, was suddenly lifeless. I went into a deep shock and couldn't stop my tears from falling as I went for my phone to call paramedics. It was kind of a blurry haze after that, and I remember everything as I saw it through my tears that day. A team of paramedics arrived, and I sat in disbelief as the police and medics swarmed the house. I just couldn't stop my tears from falling as I sat on the couch in disbelief, wondering if somehow they could still save him. The world as I knew it was about to change, and I was more unsure about the direction of my life more than ever. After I was asked to go to the police station and was questioned by police for a short time, they let me go and could see that I had nothing to do with his passing away. I had to go see some friends who might have some answers, some people who might have been with Mike in his last hours. There were only 3 or 4 people that could have been with him in our place. We were always really careful about keeping where we lived somewhat secret to most of our friends and acquaintances. We didn't really trust people we did business with, so we only ever let a few girls and a few close guy friends in our place, or even know where we lived. I heard, through George, that Misha, a guy who regularly bought from Mike to sell, was with Mike earlier that day. George told me that Mish and Mike had snorted some coke together when they'd met for a transaction, but that after just one line of coke, Mike began behaving oddly. George told me Misha said that it kind of freaked him out, and that he'd left Mike in the apartment after a brief meeting. I had my suspicions about him and didn't know him that well, but admitting to George that he was with him that day didn't exactly raise red flags, I guess, either. The thing that did have me wondering is how I knew that Mike had gotten Misha for around $1,000, soon after he'd been busted and released. After having had everything taken from him, Mike needed anything to stay afloat and to get started again. Mike had told me that Misha was looking to re-up, and that he got the money from Mish, but really took his time getting him the product, a few weeks to be exact. The guys from out of town we'd gotten for $10,000 came and got robbed by Mike shortly after, and finally after robbing Peter to pay Paul, Misha in this case, Mike had a huge mess on his hands. Who knows how mad Misha was by then, and what level he'd taken things to over that missing $1,000. I'm assuming he'd finally gotten it back that day if they were snorting lines together though, but still, I didn't know what to believe. What I do know is, a lot of people suddenly met a life-altering fate in the span of just a few weeks dealing with Mike. He had that kind of impact on people, and escaped a ton of pain in what might have been just the easier way out. You see, just weeks after his Jeep was impounded with all that weed and cash, after he'd set up 2 of his connections and robbed guys for a combined $11,000 in cash, and bought himself an almost identical Jeep Grand Cherokee, Mike was suddenly facing the 10 years in prison all over again. He'd been driving down a street near our old high school and was pulled over again in his newest Jeep Grand Cherokee. Police searched, and this time found nothing more than seeds and tiny stems of weed at the bottom of his backpack. But for a guy on parole in a strict state, it was enough to bring back the 10-year sentence that he was previously facing. Back in these days, the laws on marijuana in Maryland were extremely harsh, and from what police told me at the questioning after he passed away, the local police didn't think very highly of Mike. Perhaps it was an interviewing tactic to get a read on me, but the officer questioning me actually had the nerve to tell me that he'd heard Mike, in his words, was a real piece of shit anyway. I couldn't even get mad at that time. I was still crying and in shock. Instead of telling that cop what a dick he was for saying something like that about someone who just passed away, I just told him that Mike was always like a brother to me, and that what he or anyone else thought about him didn't matter, as the tears kept flowing. I think that was the last thing the guy said to me before telling me that was all they needed from me. It was the day of tradition to pay respect to and honor the dead. Halloween, based in the root word hallow, meaning to honor as holy, sacred even. A sort of exhibition to face our fears of death, take whatever form we wanted to in costume, and to try embracing the dead in reverence and awe. Another coincidence that I was with her on Halloween Day to learn more about her and her family? No, too many things already happened to keep calling these coincidences. During conversation, while we moved her things, we somehow had discovered that her upcoming birthday was on the day before mine. She was born on November 13th, and I was born on November 14th. But I should have been born on the 13th as well, now that I think of it, had it not been for my father and his superstition, requesting that nurses delay my birth if possible. I would have been born on a Friday the 13th in that November, had they not delayed my birth until after midnight. Anyway, I'm unsure why I asked, but I probably told her that Mike was like a brother to me while he was alive, and knowing what Mike's birthday was, I asked her what Sunny's birthday was, her only sister. When she told me that Sunny's birthday was on May 18th, I was surprised, but not overly shocked. At first I thought she was messing around, but also knew that she hadn't known Mike or his birthday to have been messing with me. Mike was born on May 19th, and Sunny was born on May 18th, while I was born on November 14th, and Shannon had been born on November 13th. I already knew there was some connection with them, being that I'd ended up knowing both of them in my life in far separate times, but now I knew for sure. See, my heart went out to Shannon and Sunny Falcon those days, because of a tragedy they dealt with within their family recently. We didn't talk about it because I thought perhaps the wounds would be too fresh either way, but word spread quickly, and I knew the story from other people talking. Her parents had recently split up, and both tragically passed away in a murder-suicide soon after. Her father shot and killed their mother in the home the two sisters had been living in with her at the time. After going to their home that morning and killing their mom, he then turned the gun on himself, shooting and killing himself. Their marriage was on the rocks after a few months' separation, and tragically, it was too much for him to bear. It's become clear to me that I've come from a place with perhaps the darkest nature of man in this world, a much darker nature of life than most have come from, perhaps. This dark side was apparent in my father for me as a young child especially, while my mother was the perfect opposite to balance this darkness with lightheartedness and love. In the same way have I come from the most misunderstood, the most mysterious things that have slowly been brought to light for me and understood by the balancing of these polarities, through the other lives involved and connected to my story. Even more sadness would follow when 4 or 5 years later, I get bad news about Shannon too. She'd passed away in a car crash while reportedly driving drunk and losing control of her car around a turn. She'll be missed here, and was nothing but a happy and kind soul. My heart goes out to all of them, but especially Sunny for dealing with all of this heartache. I've been in touch with Sunny in recent years to make sure that writing this about her and her family was okay. I hope the message within the entirety of this book finds her well. According to some, birds are known as messengers, representing angels or spirits of people who've passed. Additionally, falcons are symbolic birds in Egyptian mythology of Horus and the sun god Ra, the son of Osiris and Isis, and rightful heir to Egypt's throne. Ra and Horus were depicted as that of a falcon-headed man that represented every immortal pharaoh. Over time, pharaohs became regarded as a manifestation of Horus in life and Osiris in death, becoming reborn into countless lives ever after. How this means anything symbolic to me besides their last name being Falcon would become more clear as the years passed and the story went on. I kept finding my Egyptian roots and connection to Egypt coming back to me throughout my story in many different ways. Years passed, and I moved back to California once again. I began working at a card room, Ocean's 11 Casino, on Mission Avenue in Oceanside, California, in 2007, and I ended up meeting some coworkers just before 2012, in 2010 I think it was. People who I've become certain that I was destined to meet. I remember walking into the small break room one day and overhearing a conversation about reincarnation. I just asked if they believed in it, and if so, why. I briefly had a conversation and shared some of what I had a story to write about, and my coworker said to me, "I have some books that are meant for you." I thought to myself excitedly, here we go again. In a good way though, I was excited to see what these books were about, and it didn't take her long to come to the conclusion that these books she'd been collecting were for me. I hadn't told this coworker anything about Sunny Falcon or Shannon Falcon, but I began reading one of the books that she'd given me. It was titled The Law of One, The Ruah Contact. It was one of the many books I likely never would have heard of without her bringing it to me. I found it to be a book channeled by the authors, as they spoke with a sort of extension of the immortal mind, which called itself Ra, declaring itself a humble messenger of the one infinite creator, Adonai. Ra almost always declared its name before it spoke anything through the channeler, Carla Ruckert, and seemed to end each session the same way every time as well. I'll just read a small portion of the way that they would end sessions, before I get back into the other details that really made me begin to question whether there's some truth to those who claim that there is such a thing as pre-life planning, and that events of our lives are planned in between physical lifetimes for continued learning and for lessons that are needed, and sometimes karma repaid for many different reasons and in many different ways, with friends and families, even enemies or associates, religious groups, etc. So, a short excerpt from The Law of One, the Ra Contact. I am Ra. I leave you in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth then, rejoicing in the power and in the peace of the one infinite Creator, Adonai. They began speaking with Ra, and audio recording everything in these channeling sessions. The first one beginning the year I was born, in 1981, which I find is no coincidence either, when I began to understand what Ra explained as our other selves. They asked Ra thousands of questions when all was said and done, and received answers that addressed and confirmed much of what I've learned through my own experiences. Had I not experienced the details of my life, of countless people who'd sort of channeled with their lives, some with their lives and timing of death, and everything else that made my story, I would have been forced to consider all of this Ra channeling as nonsense. I wouldn't have understood how anyone could possibly believe this, or that it could be anything but a completely fabricated scam. I'll get back to more of what Ra spoke through this lady, beginning in 1981, but I'll just read a little bit from The Law of One before I get back to the details that led me to find these books in the first place. This is from The Law of One, Session 21. Questioner. Partial question. What was the process of scheduling of mechanism, shall I say, of reincarnation at that time? And how did the time in between incarnations into third density, human life form, physical apply to the growth of the mind, body, spirit?
I am Ra. This query is more complex than most. We shall begin. The incarnation pattern of the beginning third density, mind, body, spirit complex begins in darkness. For you may think or consider of your density as one of, as you may say, a sleep and a forgetting. This is the only plane of forgetting. It is necessary for the third density entity to forget, so that the mechanisms of confusion, or free will, may operate upon the newly individuated consciousness complex. Thus, the beginning entity is one in all innocence oriented towards animalistic behavior, using other selves only as extensions of self for the preservation of the all-self. The entity becomes slowly aware that it has needs, shall we say, that are not animalistic. That is, that are useless for survival. These needs include the need for companionship, the need for laughter, the need for beauty, the need to know the universe about it. These are the beginning needs. As the incarnations begin to accumulate, further needs are discovered. The need to trade, the need to love, the need to be loved, the need to elevate animalistic behaviors to a more universal perspective. During the first portion of third density cycles, incarnations are automatic and occur rapidly upon the cessation of energy complex of the physical vehicle. There is small need to review or to heal the experiences of the incarnation, as what you would call the energy centers begin to be activated to a higher extent. More of the content of experience during incarnation deals with the lessons of love. Thus the time, as you may understand it, between incarnations is lengthened to give appropriate attention to the review and the healing of experiences of the previous incarnation. At some point in third density, the green ray energy center becomes activated, and at that point, incarnation ceases to be automatic. Questioner: when incarnation ceases to become automatic, I am assuming that the entity can decide when he needs to reincarnate for the benefit of his own learning. Does he? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: at this time in our cycle, near the end, what percentage of the entities, approximately, incarnating are making their own choices? I am Ra. The approximate percentage is 54%. I am Ra. This query is more complex than most. We shall begin. The incarnation pattern of the beginning third density, mind-body-spirit complex begins in darkness. For you may think or consider of your density as one of, as you may say, a sleep and a forgetting. This is the only plane of forgetting. It is necessary for the third density entity to forget.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to finish this chapter, I'll leave a link here. Help me out by liking, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell to catch more of these chapters and the rest of the story still yet to come. Until next time.